Sorry. So I can see that there's a problem of reconciling the two interpretations of the master equation, but I didn't understand how this stochastic boundary model solves it. That I don't have an intuition for how that reconciles the two.
Okay, so the basic answer to that is that with diffusion approximation, you don't go into this kind of a contradiction, because you no longer have a master equation with this exponential time transition that depends one on the other. So that's the basic idea. So the diffusion approximation, you don't have anymore that kind of a problem with the thing.
But what are the units of this model? Are you at the
You just
level, not species level? What level are you operating at in this?
with the diffusion approximation. So you are working pretty much with a new stochastic variable, which is the proportion of individuals. And you follow the flux of probability of a zillion of systems where this frequency is changing until you arrive to a particular final or invariant distribution.
So you're not, okay, so that makes sense. So what you're doing is you're looking at the data for the proportion.
Right.
You're not trying to reconcile those two.
Exactly. Not anymore. And you work with the proportion, so you work in the continuum, and the traditional approach has been to work with the number of individuals. So that's where you get into the trouble. Yeah.
Hi. I'm not 100% who this is for, because I guess you all are sort of experts in this, but I guess I'm wondering, when you apply these inferential methods like maxent and its relatives, there's some input to those methods, which is the constraints. And my question, I guess, is how much input is there? How much, what constraints are going into this? How much of sort of things you've learned from data are going into it, and then it's going back to explain the data versus just, oh, we put in two constraints and we get out all these very nice plots that you all had?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the issue of how to select constraints is where it's some mix of science and intuition and who knows what. There's no theory of what the constraints have to be. So in thermodynamics, it was learned empirically that pressure, volume, and temperature sufficed for equilibrium thermodynamics. For ecology, we started with what seemed like the obvious. Area has to matter, and because we all think and talk about species and species richness, that had to matter. Individuals matter. And then we said, okay, let's add one resource, metabolism, an energy or resource, whichever you want to call it. If we had added an extra resource, another quantity, call it W for water, then it's very interesting what happens. You get a very distinct prediction. Instead of the Fisher log series popping out, which has its 1 over n behavior at small n, you get 1 over n squared. If you add 2 new resources, you get 1 over n cubed. And every time you add additional resources, maxent gives more and more rarity, which makes intuitive sense, because with more resources, there are more ways to survive as a rare species. But we had to learn that empirically. We didn't have a theory that said there are only 3 state variables.
Wait,
I have two comments. One is on these inverse size distributions of events. Just to mention that perhaps on the here talking about universality, that there are very nice simple stochastic models of spread that are modifications of the original forest fire model that have been applied to both intermittent epidemics in historical cholera, in measles these days that's vaccination phase, and in forest fires. And these are not the traditional forest fire model, but it's interesting that there is a critical transition that separates whether whether the dynamics of the outbreaks are controlled by depletion of resources and the replenishment, or whether it is that growth is not good enough. So that spread is not good enough. And I think that is interesting because perhaps it connects to the role of the big animals, that you need these very large events for the system to be under this kind of nonlinear kind of control, rather than this kind of birth-death process under the, and I think it's very analogous to what I was showing about the genes, where the nonlinearity on the right of the threshold matters. Once you cross that critical threshold, you are drifting. You are drifting in terms of diversity, you are drifting in terms of what determines the size of events. To me, there is a wonderful analogy there, and I will speculate even further, because the formula we derive for that transition is connected to an equation by in population genetics, a reaction diffusion, well, not reaction, a diffusion equation for the time that the new gene stays in the system. That is exactly this Kolmogorov diffusion equation, but it's a nonlinear one, so we had to solve it a bit as we could. But I think there are some connections there between these interesting patterns that you guys describe that are regularities, and what can we say about these collapses and how far we are from these collapses. And I really hope that we can make those connections, because I think there are pieces here that are wonderful in terms of can we get there, which is telling how far are we from these collapses, and not just with the traditional tipping points, but with these with these systems that are very diverse, that have all this stochasticity, etc.
One more. I have a question at the intersection of John's talk and Jen's talk. I'm interested in the effects of disturbance on the structure of ecosystems. And John, you did not go down to the level of guilds, but Jen mentioned some regularities there, such as most ecosystems having about 37% parasites. So between the two of you, would you expect that to be affected by disturbance? Would more disturbed ecosystems have more parasites or less, would you predict?
Okay, is this on? I don't know about the specific parasite. And it's, parasites are probably 30 to 60% of the diversity in any system. But I just want to say something about disturbance. The regularities we think we see in ecological network structure, I think, when you go to very disturbed systems or recovery from disturbance, that you will see, kind of in the spirit of dynamite, you will see a push away from the central tendencies that we see in more static or, pseudo equilibrial systems. And it's hard to get that data. But there are some indications of it. We have there's food web data built on top of the Simberloff-Wilson mangrove islet defaunation experiments that basically show when you defaunate the mangrove islets and then watch how they recover. And if you look at the actual food webs and how they recover, they start off, looking very different in terms of their organization compared to what I was showing. Generalists tend to colonize first, and then you start to fill in the more rare, or, in terms of links, the more specialized species. People are starting to compile the data to look at this across major extinctions. So that's an ecological extinction and recovery. I think it's really cool and something we've talked about for, from the beginning of the paleo food web stuff, of like trying to compile data to look at it in evolutionary geologic timescales. And I think there too you would expect to see a pretty major deviation, and maybe that relates to the kind of the shorter ecological disturbance versus the longer term geologic evolutionary disturbance. So, do you have any?
I agree with everything you said.
Okay. Yeah.
Something about the parasites in the work of Kevin Lafferty for those marshes along California. In fact, he has looked at more disturbed ecosystems and the proportion of parasites. And I would say for certain macroparasites, their importance would diminish a bit paradoxically with perturbations. We are not talking here about disease. We are talking about parasites that are part of the ecosystem as very diverse and with complex life cycles. So they require diversity of the non-parasitic animals to be in the system. And as you disturb it, you lose them.
Okay, one more, and then we'll finish.
One more, that there are two. One from Ryan. Did you include the human as another entity in the last model? Because you talk about the nutrients being, not distributed, but if you take into account all the commercial of food around the world, I mean, phosphorus and nitrogen and water is moving around. I mean, if we could develop a kernel for the different nutrients, you will see it will be very fat-tailed these days.
The quick answer is no, we did not.
Okay.
We talk about that actually quite a bit. Yeah, that's obviously the next step, right, and include the human component. We just wanted to know, as we reduce the size ranges in the biosphere, what's the effectively, the effect on the biosphere itself, just from that signal alone, not even including humans in the picture. Yeah.
Let's stop there. Thanks. There's much more that could be said, obviously. Let's take a really short